Every small town has its legends, but the town of Gray Hollow had one that sent shivers down every spine, especially on Valentine's Day. It wasn't just a story whispered by teenagers to scare one another. It was a grim reality etched into the town's history. Years ago, in the 1970s, Gray Hollow's most infamous tragedy occurred at the old Stonewall Manor. It was once the grandest house in town, owned by the rich and eccentric Abernathy family. The family was known for their lavish Valentine's Day parties, where the elite would gather for an evening of champagne, music, and romance. But in 1974, the party ended in unimaginable horror. That year, the invitations promised a night to remember. Guests arrived dressed in their finest, the manor glowing with soft pink lights and adorned with roses. Everything seemed perfect until the lights went out. The power outage was brief, lasting no more than 5 minutes. But when the lights flickered back on, screams erupted. Blood painted the pristine white walls. Bodies lay sprawled across the marble floor, lifeless and cold. The entire Abernathy family, 6 members, and 10 of their guests were brutally murdered. The killer had vanished, leaving no trace. The crime scene was a chaotic mess of broken glass, overturned furniture, and roses soaked in blood. The police were baffled, and despite their efforts, the case was never solved. Over time, it became known as the Valentine's Day Massacre of Gray Hollow. Decades passed, and Stonewall Manor fell into disrepair, abandoned and avoided by the townsfolk. But every Valentine's Day, the house seemed to come alive, its windows glowing faintly as if the party were still happening. Some claimed to hear music and laughter from inside, while others swore they saw shadowy figures dancing in the grand ballroom. Enter Claire and Daniel, a couple who had recently moved to Gray Hollow. They were young, adventurous, and skeptical of ghost stories. When they heard about the manor's dark history, they saw it as an opportunity for a thrilling Valentine's Day experience. "We should go," Daniel said, grinning mischievously. "See if the ghosts invite us to their party." Claire laughed nervously. "You're joking, right? Come on, it'll be fun. Just you, me, and a little adventure. What's the worst that could happen?" Reluctantly, Claire agreed. On Valentine's night, armed with flashlights and a bottle of wine, they made their way to the manor. The air was bitterly cold, and a heavy fog clung to the ground, making the decaying mansion look even more menacing. Pushing open the creaking front door, they stepped into the grand foyer. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, but faintly, Claire thought she could smell roses. "This place is incredible," Daniel whispered, shining his flashlight over the peeling wallpaper and cracked chandeliers. "Incredibly creepy," Claire muttered, shivering. They wandered through the house, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The once luxurious rooms were now filled with dust and decay. Yet, as they explored, an eerie sense of déjà vu settled over Claire. In the dining room, the long table was still set with tarnished silverware and shattered wine glasses, as if the guests had just left. "This is where it happened," Daniel said, his voice low. Claire frowned. "How do you know that?" "I read about it," he replied, but there was something strange in his tone. As they moved into the ballroom, the atmosphere grew heavier. The large windows were streaked with grime, but moonlight filtered through, casting long, twisted shadows. "Happy Valentine's Day," Daniel said, pulling out the wine bottle. But before he could open it, a faint sound stopped them both in their tracks. Music. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was soft, distant, and haunting. A melody played on an old piano. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Daniel nodded, his face pale. "It's probably the wind," but Claire knew better. The music grew louder, accompanied by the faint sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The air grew warm, the scent of roses overwhelming. The once empty ballroom was now filled with ghostly figures. They were dressed in 1970s attire, their movements fluid and otherworldly as they danced to the eerie melody. At the center of the room stood the Abernathy family, their faces frozen in a grotesque mix of smiles and deathly pallor. Claire clutched Daniel's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We need to leave. Now." But Daniel didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the figures, his expression blank. "They're beautiful," he murmured, stepping forward. "Daniel, stop!" Claire screamed, but it was too late. The ghostly dancers turned toward them, their hollow eyes locking onto Claire. The music stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. "Join us," a voice whispered, cold and menacing. Claire grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him toward the door. But the room seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit growing further and further away. She could feel the icy hands of the spirits reaching for her, their laughter echoing in her ears. With one final burst of strength, she dragged Daniel out of the house. The moment they crossed the threshold, the sound ceased. The manor was dark and silent once more. They stumbled into the foggy night, gasping for air. But as they looked back, Claire noticed something chilling. In the cracked window of the ballroom, a figure stood watching them, a woman in a blood-stained gown, holding a rose. The next morning, the townsfolk found Claire and Daniel's car abandoned near the manor. The couple was never seen again, and every Valentine's Day since, new figures joined the ghostly dance in Stonewall Manor, their faces forever etched with the same mix of terror and sorrow. Valentine's Day was supposed to be special. For Mia and Jack, it was their first romantic getaway, a chance to escape the chaos of their lives and focus on each other. The small town they chose was known for its charm: cobblestone streets, candlelit restaurants, and the kind of timeless romance that felt like stepping into a storybook. But behind the picturesque facade, this town harbored a dark and chilling secret, one that would forever haunt them. The trouble started as soon as they checked into the inn. The receptionist was an older woman with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome," she said, sliding their key across the counter. But just as Mia reached for it, the woman's face darkened. She leaned in close, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Stay away from the East Wing after midnight." Mia froze, confused. "Why?" she asked. The receptionist only shook her head, her gaze darting nervously toward the darkened hallway. "Just don't," she muttered before hurrying off, leaving them standing there in uneasy silence. Jack laughed it off, brushing it aside as local superstition. "Probably just a silly ghost story to scare the tourists," he said. But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that the warning was more than just folklore. Their room was cozy, with antique furniture and soft lighting, but something about the place felt off. As Mia unpacked, she swore she felt a chill in the air, despite the warmth of the radiator. The window creaked as though someone had pushed against it from the outside, but when she looked, there was nothing but empty darkness. At dinner, they tried to focus on each other, but the atmosphere of the inn was hard to ignore. The dining hall was beautiful, adorned with fairy lights and roses, yet it felt eerily quiet, as though the building itself was holding its breath. While Jack excused himself to use the restroom, Mia sat alone, sipping her wine. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it was almost imperceptible. "Mia," her name. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She glanced around, but the room was full of happy couples, laughing and toasting. No one seemed to notice her sudden panic. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the sound lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. Later that night, as they walked back to their room, the hallway seemed darker than before. The dim lights flickered, casting long, ominous shadows along the walls. Their room was near the east wing, and as they passed its entrance, a cold draft swept through, chilling Mia to the bone. "Creepy," Jack said with a chuckle, nudging her playfully. But Mia couldn't laugh. Something about that hallway felt wrong, like it was alive, watching them. They settled into bed, but sleep didn't come easily for Mia. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old building, set her nerves on edge. At exactly midnight, she heard it again, a soft, mournful cry echoing through the hall. It started faint, like a distant wind, but grew louder, turning into unmistakable sobs. "Jack," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "It's probably just the wind," he mumbled, rolling over. But Mia knew it wasn't the wind. The cries were too human, too filled with sorrow to be anything natural. Unable to ignore it, she slipped out of bed, her heart pounding as she stepped into the hallway. The cries grew louder, pulling her toward the east wing. The air grew colder with each step, her breath visible in the dim light. The sound of her bare feet on the creaking floor seemed deafening in the silence. At the end of the corridor stood a door, slightly ajar. Beyond it, faint moonlight spilled into what appeared to be an old ballroom. Mia hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But something compelled her forward, an invisible force she couldn't resist. The ballroom was frozen in time, its grandeur faded but still hauntingly beautiful. Dust motes danced in the pale light, and the faint scent of roses lingered in the air. In the center of the room stood a woman in a tattered wedding dress. Her back was to Mia, her long veil trailing across the floor like a ghostly shadow. "Hello," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. The woman turned slowly, her movements unnaturally fluid. As she lifted her veil, Mia's breath caught in her throat. The bride's face was pale and hollow, her eyes black voids that seemed to suck the air from the room. Her lips twisted into a sorrowful smile as she whispered, "You're not him." Mia stumbled backward, her body paralyzed with terror. The bride began to move toward her, her feet gliding above the floor. "He promised me forever," she wailed, her voice a haunting echo that filled the room. "Why did he leave me?" As the ghost reached out, her translucent fingers just inches from Mia's face, a voice broke through the terror. "Mia!" Jack's shout shattered the spell, and the apparition vanished in an instant. Mia collapsed into Jack's arms, sobbing as she tried to explain what had happened. Together, they fled the ballroom, slamming the door behind them. The next morning, they demanded answers from the receptionist. Her face was pale as she recounted the tale of the ghost bride. Decades ago, a young woman had been abandoned at the altar by her fiancé. Heartbroken and humiliated, she returned to the inn, where they had planned to spend their wedding night, and ended her life in the East Wing. Since then, her restless spirit had haunted the inn, searching for the man who had promised her forever. Mia and Jack left the inn that day, their romantic getaway forever marred by the horrors they had witnessed. But for Mia, the nightmare didn't end there. Even now, years later, she wakes in the middle of the night to the faint sound of a bride's mournful cries, echoing through the darkness. And sometimes, just for a moment, she feels the icy touch of a ghostly hand on her shoulder. Sophie had been single for a while, and Valentine's Day always seemed to mock her loneliness. This year, she decided to try something new: online dating. After a few days of swiping and chatting, she matched with a man named Ethan. His profile was perfect: charming smile, shared interests, and a subtle wit that made her laugh through their messages. When Ethan suggested they meet for dinner on Valentine's Day, Sophie didn't hesitate. It felt right, like the kind of spontaneous romance she had been longing for. He picked a quaint little restaurant on the outskirts of town, one she had never heard of before but found enchanting when she looked it up. The night of the date, Sophie dressed in her best, her excitement tinged with nervous energy. The restaurant was nestled on a quiet, tree-lined street. Warm light spilled from its windows, and the faint sound of a violin played from inside. It felt magical, almost too perfect. Ethan was already there when she arrived. He stood near the entrance, his dark coat contrasting sharply with the soft glow of the restaurant's lanterns. "Sophie," he said warmly, extending a hand. His voice was smooth, his presence magnetic. The evening unfolded like a dream. Ethan was attentive, his eyes never leaving hers as they talked. He seemed to know exactly what to say, effortlessly steering the conversation from lighthearted banter to deep, meaningful exchanges. For the first time in a long time, Sophie felt seen, understood. As the night wore on, she noticed something odd. Ethan never ate. While Sophie enjoyed her meal, he merely sipped his wine, his glass never seeming to empty. She brushed it off, assuming he wasn't hungry, but a part of her couldn't shake the strange detail. After dessert, Ethan suggested they take a walk. The streets were quiet, the cold air crisp but not biting. They strolled side by side, their footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. Ethan led her toward a small park nearby, its barren trees casting long shadows under the pale moonlight. "This was the best Valentine's Day I've ever had," Sophie said, her voice soft. Ethan smiled, but there was something sad in his expression. "I'm glad. You deserve it." They reached a bench beneath an old oak tree. Ethan gestured for her to sit, and she did, feeling the rough wood beneath her fingers. He stood before her, his hands in his pockets, his gaze distant. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The atmosphere had shifted, the warmth of the evening replaced by an unsettling chill. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I shouldn't be here," Ethan said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm not like you." "What do you mean?" Sophie asked, her confusion deepening. Ethan hesitated, his expression pained. "I died 3 years ago, on Valentine's Day." Sophie laughed nervously, waiting for him to admit it was a joke. But his face remained solemn, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're joking," she said, her voice faltering. "I wish I were," he replied. "I was supposed to meet someone here at this very restaurant. I never made it. A car accident. It was instant, but I couldn't move on. I've been trapped, reliving this day over and over, waiting for someone who could see me." The blood drained from Sophie's face. "This isn't funny, Ethan." He stepped closer, his form seeming to blur at the edges. "I didn't mean to scare you. I didn't even think you'd notice me. Most people don't. But you did, Sophie. You saw me." Her breath came in short gasps, her mind racing to make sense of his words. The chill in the air grew sharper, cutting through her coat and biting at her skin. She stood abruptly, backing away from him. "I have to go," she stammered, her voice shaking. "Sophie, wait," Ethan pleaded, his voice filled with sorrow. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't want to be alone." But Sophie couldn't stay. She turned and ran, her heels clicking loudly against the pavement. The shadows of the trees seemed to twist and reach for her as she fled, her heart pounding in her chest. When she finally reached the restaurant, she burst through the door, gasping for air. The hostess looked up, startled by her sudden entrance. "Are you okay, ma'am?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "Ethan," Sophie managed to say between breaths. "The man I was with, where is he?" The hostess frowned, her confusion evident. "I'm sorry, but you came in alone." Sophie shook her head, her mind reeling. "No, I didn't. We had dinner. He was sitting right across from me." The hostess exchanged a glance with the waiter, who approached cautiously. "Miss, you've been sitting at that table by yourself all night." Sophie's stomach turned. She looked back at the table, her empty wine glass and plate the only evidence of her presence. The chair across from hers was untouched, the napkins still neatly folded. Tears welled in her eyes as she stumbled out of the restaurant. The street was empty, the park shrouded in darkness. She could still feel Ethan's presence, his voice echoing in her mind. "I didn't want to be alone." That night, Sophie lay awake, unable to shake the haunting memory. And every Valentine's Day since, she feels it. The cold touch of a ghostly hand, the whisper of a voice that once made her feel alive. Ethan is still waiting, trapped in his eternal Valentine's nightmare. And Sophie knows, deep down, that she'll never truly escape him.